I know that if I close my eyes, I can still hear that creak of the gates when they were opened at dawn. A creak that for us was like a gong, calling not to prayer, but to another day in which your hands would burn from work and your back would be wet with sweat until the sun went down behind the horizon. But today I will tell you what I have kept inside for so many years, like a whisper in the dark. Because if I do not speak, my story will die with me. I was born in a small house behind the plantation in Louisiana. My mother, Sarah, was a quiet woman who could stop my childish stubbornness with just one glance. She said that I came into the world on a night when the moon stood so close, as if it wanted to touch us. I did not know my father. They said he was a dark-skinned man from a neighboring state who was sold before I even learned to walk. My mother and I worked in the cotton fields, and in the evenings she taught me to sing softly so that the whites would not hear, songs in which we hid our dreams. My childhood was short. I still remember the day when the ropes stretched from the heavy baskets burned my hands for the first time. It was hot. The earth gave its warmth straight into my feet, and it seemed that the sun was baking the sky until it cracked. I was still laughing then, playing tag with the boys between the cotton bushes. But then I heard a whistle over my head. The whip struck the air right next to my ear. I fell to the ground. And at that moment I realized that laughter was a luxury we almost never had. Life flowed between work and brief moments of rest. In the morning it smelled of fresh bread baked in the stone oven near the kitchen, and in the evening of smoke from the fires where the women cooked porridge from cornmeal. Sometimes I loved to listen to the men tell stories about the free lands in the north, about cities where you could walk wherever you wanted, and no one would ask whose you were. Then I would look at the stars and think that maybe one of them was my road to freedom. But on the plantation, there were always its own secrets. The white house of the master stood a little apart, behind an alley of oaks, and we went there only by order. Older girls than me worked there, serving in the dining room and cleaning the rooms. Rumors went around that some of them returned from there in tears, but no one dared to ask what had happened. We just saw their eyes become empty, as if all the warmth had been drawn out of them. I was in the house for the first time when I was only 14 years old. I was sent to wash the floors in the hall. The master walked by, and his gaze lingered on me. It was a look that made cold run down my spine, even though the room was stuffy. He said nothing, but I knew. It was better not to catch his eye without a reason. That same night, I heard a whisper behind the kitchen. It was Martha, a woman whose face was a mix of weariness and firmness. She told me to always stay close to the older women, never be alone in a room with the master, and never trust any of the overseers. Her words became a talisman for me. I realized that in this land, those who survive are not the strongest, but those who can see danger before it comes close. There were other scenes I will not forget. Once, a young man named Joseph refused to go out to the field on Sunday, saying that it was the day of God. They tied him up and beat him in front of everyone. I was standing in the crowd, clenching my hands so as not to scream. There was no fear in his eyes, only stubbornness. And I thought that maybe this is what true freedom looks like, even if your body is in chains. And there was also Lila. She worked in the kitchen and could cook so well that the smell of her stew could make you forget about everything. We often shared bread and talked in the evenings. But one day I learned that they were going to sell her to another state. She sat by the river, looking at the water, and quietly said, "Maybe it will be better there, or worse, but it is no longer my choice." The next morning they took her away, and I never saw her again. That night I could not sleep for a long time. It seemed to me that the river was whispering her name, and I thought, we are all like these waters. They drive us where they want, but we still flow as long as we have strength. It happened on a day when the sun rose red, as if stained with blood. The air held the smell of damp earth after the night rain, and mist stretched over the fields, making everything around look like a dream. But this dream quickly turned into a nightmare. At dawn, the overseers came earlier than usual, and with them was a man in a gray frock coat whom we had never seen before. He walked slowly, looking over each of us as if he were choosing goods at a market. I stood aside, trying not to meet his gaze, but he still came closer. His fingers touched my chin, lifting my face, and I felt my heart sink into my feet. He said something to the master, and they both laughed. After that, they no longer sent me to the field. I was sent into the house. At first, I thought it was luck, since work in the house seemed easier. But Martha, the same one who had once warned me, only looked into my eyes and quietly said, "Guard your soul, girl. They will take the body anyway." The house smelled different, not of dust and sweat, but of wax, rose water, and roasted meat. But behind that smell, there was always danger. I learned to move quickly, to sweep crumbs off the table before the master could notice, and to keep my head down. But one day, he still found a way to make me lift my eyes. It was in the evening, after the guests had left, and the dining room was silent. He came up behind me, put his hands on my shoulders, and said, "You are my special one now." The words were soft, but there was an order in them that made me feel cold. I began looking for any way not to be alone with him. Sometimes I managed to hide in the kitchen, helping Lizzie knead dough. Sometimes I would deliberately spill water on the floor, so that the overseer would send me with a rag to a far corner. But one day I was not so lucky. He found me in the attic, where I was hanging laundry, and locked the door. I will not say what happened next, but that night I first understood what it meant to hate so deeply that even breathing became pain. A few weeks later, I noticed that something had changed. My body had become different, and I knew what it meant. Fear gripped me, for I had heard stories of girls who disappeared when they became pregnant by the master. I did not know what to do until Martha noticed the look in my eyes, full of horror. She led me behind the barn and said, "If the child is born, it will be your blood, but his blood will be half theirs. You must decide whether you want him to stay here." Her words rang in my head like a bell. In those days, another person appeared on the plantation who changed my fate. His name was Eli. He was tall, with strong hands and eyes in which lived a quiet strength. He worked in the stables and knew how to handle horses so that they obeyed him without a whip. We began to speak secretly, meeting in passing when he brought water or I carried clean laundry. In his words there was simplicity, but also a warmth I had long been missing. One evening, he told me that he knew the way north, that there were people who helped those like us get to freedom. I listened to him, and in my chest, for the first time in a long while, something like hope was lit. But I knew I could not leave alone. Inside me beat a tiny heart that no one but Martha knew about. The more Eli and I spoke, the clearer it became that we needed each other. But it was dangerous. One day the overseer caught us talking by the well. He said nothing, just smiled in a way that froze the blood in my veins. The next day Eli was punished. His back was cut with the whip so badly that he could not stand for several days. I cared for him at night, brought water, and treated his wounds. He did not groan, only sometimes whispered, "We will leave anyway." And then something happened that I will never forget. One night I was awakened by a knock at the window. It was Eli. He said that we had a chance, that tomorrow in the forest there would be people ready to take us across the river. But I knew it was already too late. The time was near, and my body carried the child heavily. I could not run, could not leap over stones, or hide in the swamps. I told him to go without me. He silently pressed my face to his chest and said that without me he would not go. That night I understood that love is not just words. It is the choice to stay, even when freedom is within arm's reach. The labor began in the deepest night, when the moon hid behind the clouds, and the wind carried dry leaves across the yard, scratching them against the walls of the barn. The pain came in waves that made it hard for me to breathe. Martha was beside me, holding my hand and whispering words that I later could no longer remember, only feeling the strength in them, like in the old prayers passed from woman to woman. In the master's house there was a feast. Guests were laughing, glasses clinking. The smell of roasted meat and wine filled the air. No one there knew that in a dark corner of the plantation a battle for life was going on, for mine and my child's. When the waters broke, Martha told me not to cry out. "Let them think you are sleeping," she said. But I could not hold back a moan, and at that moment the barn door opened slightly. On the threshold stood the overseer, with a face that always reminded me of cold stone. He looked silently at me, twisting in pain, and smirked. "Let her give birth," he said, "but tomorrow she will go out to the field. No one spoils children here." The door closed, and I was again left with Martha. She worked quickly, put an old blanket under me, wiped my forehead, pressed me to her chest when the contractions became so strong it felt as though my body would tear apart. The child was born by morning, small, warm, with tiny fingers that clung to mine as if he already knew the world was unsafe. I looked at him and thought that maybe for him I had to find more strength than I had left. Martha smiled, but there was so much sorrow in her eyes that I understood. Ahead of us awaited not joy, but struggle. At first, I carried him on my back, wrapped in cloth, and went out to the field as ordered. He slept to the sound of the wind and the rustle of leaves while I picked cotton, feeling each branch scratch my hands. Sometimes I sang to him softly, the same words my mother sang to me when I was little. But I knew this could not continue. The child could be taken to the house, given to the servants to raise, and I would only see him from afar. Eli was there all this time, as much as he could be. Sometimes he would leave a small piece of cornbread under a bush or a clay toy he had carved himself. He almost never spoke of escape, but I saw in his eyes that the thought was alive. One day he quietly said, "There is a way that is safer, but we will have to wait for a dark, cold night. One when they won't let the dogs out." I listened to him and understood that now there were 3 of us, and a mistake could cost us everything. But we could not wait. In the evening, when the master had gone to the city and the overseers were drunk, Eli came to me and said, "Tonight." My heart was beating so loudly I could hear it in my ears. We wrapped the baby, took a little food, and stepped into the darkness, trying not to make a sound. The moon was a thin crescent, and the shadows seemed longer than usual. We walked toward the forest, holding each other's hands. Branches caught on our clothes. Somewhere in the distance, a night bird cried. It seemed that everything was going according to plan, until barking broke out. At first it was muffled, then it came closer and closer, and I felt the ground disappear from under my feet. Eli whispered for me to run ahead to the river, and he stayed behind. I wanted to shout, but my throat was dry. I ran, pressing the child to me, feeling the cold air cut my face. Ahead, I saw the water, black as a moonless night. I stepped into it up to my knees, then to my waist, holding the baby above my head. The pounding in my ears mixed with the splashing, and I did not know if I would reach the other shore. Behind me came Eli's shout and the snapping of branches. I did not see him, but I knew he would not turn back, even if it cost him his life. The night thickened like syrup. The water chilled around my ankles and pulled me down, as if asking me to stay. I held the child high and kept moving forward, hearing barking and the brittle crack of branches behind me, and then a shot like thunder without lightning. The air shuddered, birds burst from the reeds, and the silence split with a cry. I knew that sound. A rifle. I called out to Eli, but my voice broke, and my name came back from the water only as a whisper. A wave lifted us, cold, cutting my skin, reeds scratching my thighs, and the child began to cry, as if a small bell was beating in my chest, calling me not to stop. Out of the darkness on the opposite bank, a small light flared, just one, like the eye of a night bird. Then a second appeared. Two lights that those who know the way understand, as a signal to come. From the shadows, a boat emerged. A woman in a man's jacket held a pole and looked at me so directly it felt as though she could see not only me but also my fears. She whispered for me not to make a sound, pulled the boat closer, and took the child so gently, as if he were a cup of warm milk. We had almost gotten into the boat when, from the other bank, came the voice of the overseer. He called my name, stretching out the sounds, promising that if I came back, they would not sell me and the child would be kept with me. His promises were like sticky honey with bitterness at the bottom. Behind him walked the man in the gray frock coat, the one who once lifted my chin and said a few precious words to the master. He raised the rifle and aimed, not at me, but at that small flame I had kept alive in my chest. Then Eli burst out of the bushes. He walked straight, stumbled, rose again. I saw the blood on his shirt and understood that he was already hearing the world more faintly than before. He shouted for me not to look back and to go. He turned toward those chasing us, raised his hands as if to embrace the air itself, and I realized he had become my wall. The shot tore through the night again. Eli did not fall at once. He smiled at me, so quietly that the smile was only for me, and formed with his fingers the sign we used in secret to say the word hope. Then he swayed and disappeared into the tall grass. The woman in the boat yanked me by the collar. The boat slid forward. The water hissed against the sides. I held the child and counted his breaths as if they were steps toward home. On the bank, someone beat a paddle against an empty bucket. That sound was the signal for those who were waiting for us further on. We landed on a clay bank where a short man with a scar on his cheek and the smell of soap on his hands was waiting. He led us deep into the forest, where fireflies glowed like tiny lanterns. We walked along a path known only to someone who has escaped many times. The woman said her name was Grace. She did not ask for mine. People who pull you from the darkness rarely ask names. I wanted to tell her about Eli, but the words broke. Grace nudged me forward and told me to think only of the child's breathing. We reached an old haystack by a leaning barn. There, a thin young man waited with a basket, under whose rags were crackers and a bottle of milk. His eyes darted about, but his hands were warm and quick. We hid in the hay until dawn. I listened to the forest breathing, to the far-off water repeating its endless prayer, and I tried to catch even the smallest sound of Eli. But the night did not return his voice to me. Morning brought dampness and new fear. Grace said we could go no further. The overseers had covered the whole bank, and we had to bury ourselves in the earth like a seed and wait for night. There, in the damp half-light, I fed the child, and tears fell onto his forehead. On his skin was a tiny birthmark shaped like wings, and for the first time, I thought that this mark had been given for a reason. I whispered to him that his father had held the sky over our heads for as long as he could, and that he still held that sky now, even if I could no longer see his hands. By midday, a sound came from afar. At first thin, like the song of a mosquito, then louder. Grace paled. She said it was not a church bell, but the iron clapper of an overseer whose hearing was better than a dog's. That meant they had sniffed us out. She ordered the young man to take me to the next point and to run by another path. She herself went toward the sound, limping like a tired horse, though she walked quickly and with resolve. We reached a small clearing with an abandoned cart. Beneath the bed was a low pit hidden with branches and brush. I climbed down into it with the child, the earth smelling of mold and iron, my breath sticking to the walls of my throat. The young man laid the branches above us, and the world became dark as a closed hand. In the darkness, time turned thick. I thought of Martha and felt anxiety pulling the air out of me. If they did not find me at the river, they would go to the house. They would figure out who had helped and strike where it would hurt most. By evening, we heard footsteps, heavy, uneven. Someone passed close by, pushed the branches aside with a stick, held their breath, then spat and went away. I pressed my lips to the child's hair and prayed with every word I knew. The night covered us again. The young man returned and said the bank had been plowed like a field, that they had found traces of blood, that on the road they had seen a woman in a jacket with a torn sleeve. He did not know if she was breathing. He spoke carefully, as people do about someone who always chooses the dangerous side of the road. I could not stand it. I said I would go back. The young man grabbed my shoulders, but my mind was made up. If they turned the house upside down, if they tore apart those who remained, my freedom would become an empty word. I took the child and went back to the plantation, to those gates where every dawn had been my bell. I went because sometimes returning is not weakness, but the price you pay for those you love. When I entered the yard, the air smelled of carbolic acid and smoke. People crowded near the kitchen. On the porch sat Martha, her back straight, her face quiet. On the floor beside her lay a whip. The master stood in a white vest, the man in the gray frock coat beside him like a shadow. They looked at me and at the child. The master smiled as if he had won. He said that if I stayed obedient, Martha would live and my boy would be taught good manners in the house. Inside me, everything hummed like a beehive. I lifted my head and for the first time looked into the mistress's eyes. In her pupils was such exhaustion, as if she too had long lived in a cage. I whispered to her what I knew, about the letters in the dressing table drawer, about a cousin in the north, and about the books that could not be kept in the White House. I did not threaten. I offered a choice. If Martha stayed alive, if the child stayed with me, my silence would be stronger than an oak door. The mistress did not flinch, but her fingers on the corset lace trembled. She said one word, enough. The man in gray turned his head toward me, like a predator who does not expect its prey to speak. The master knew he was tangled in bad secrets, and he understood that today he would be better off loving the appearance of calm. They sent me to the laundry. Martha remained alive, but her eyes had become deep like a well after a drought. The child was with me, and yet I knew that the game had only begun. At the next dawn, I saw on the line between the sheets a cloth with the pattern of an arrow and a small star. Martha had hung it as if by accident. I understood. In a world where things do not speak, sometimes cloth does. An arrow means a path. A star means night. I began to wait again. I waited the way one waits for rain in a drought, not looking at the sky, but feeling that it was already falling somewhere beyond the horizon. The days stretched thick like molasses. In the morning, I washed sheets in a large wooden tub, and the boy slept on an old basket beside me. Sometimes he would wake, and his eyes would catch the sunlight through the window bars, as if he were already searching for a way out. Martha barely spoke, but we knew how to communicate without words. When the water in the kettle boiled, she tapped the spoon twice if someone was coming, and once if it was safe to talk. In the evenings, when the yard grew quiet, we sat by the stove, and I softly sang to the boy songs in which every word was like a knot of memory, so he would know who he was and where he came from, even if one day he was left alone. Everything changed on the night when the mistress called me to the house again. I walked down the dark hallway, my heart beating as if it wanted to break free. She was waiting for me in a small room without windows, only a candle on the table and the smell of lavender. On the table lay an envelope tied with twine. She slowly pushed it toward me. "These are your papers," she said quietly, so that her words almost drowned in the crackle of the wick. "Not real, but good ones." I did not understand at once why she was doing this. The mistress did not look at me, only at her hands. "My husband thinks he holds everyone on a chain, but he holds me too," she whispered. "You will go when the sign comes. Martha knows." She stood as if the conversation was over, and I understood. I had to remember this moment in every detail because we would never speak of it again. A week later, the sign came. It was the same sheet with an embroidered arrow and star, only now it had a small red stitch added. The night was windless, like before a storm. Martha woke me, put the boy in my arms, and whispered, "Now." We went to the barn, where flour sacks were usually kept. Behind them was an old door I had never seen before. It led to a narrow passage between the wall and the fence. We moved, sliding along the ground, until we reached the far edge of the plantation. There stood the same young man with the scar on his cheek. In his hands was a horse without a saddle. He said the road ahead was only for those ready not to look back. We climbed on. I held the child close, and the horse began to walk, stepping softly on the damp ground. The wind struck my face. The darkness parted only one step ahead. I felt the boy trembling and whispered to him that soon we would be where he could walk on grass without fearing the whip. But in my chest still lived a heaviness. I could not leave Martha in that place, no matter how far we went. At dawn, we stopped at a small chapel on the edge of the forest. The door was ajar. A candle burned inside. An old priest with eyes holding more weariness than years met us. He gave us bread and water, said others would take us further. But before we left, he quietly asked, "Is there someone who must be brought out from there?" I only nodded. He understood everything without words. After that was the road into the unknown. We walked along paths that twisted like snakes, crossed streams, and hid in barns. Sometimes we heard barking and voices, but they did not find us. I began to believe we might succeed. But my heart still pulled back to where Martha remained, where in the white house a woman in the scent of lavender carried secrets heavier than iron. In the evening, when we stopped by an old mill, the young man with the scar said that here I must stay for a few days until it was safe to move on. He looked at my son and said, "He has the eyes of someone who will remember." I embraced the child, and suddenly I understood everything that had been, everything we had lost, everything still ahead, now lived in him. I do not know if we will reach the end of the road. I do not know if I will see Eli or Martha again. But I know that if my boy one day asks where he comes from, I will tell him everything about the rivers that kept us safe in the dark, about the people who silently opened doors, about those who stayed in the cage so that others could break free. And if he asks what became of me, I will say that I am still walking. Because as long as you walk, you are alive.